Sandhills, Nebraska, October 1882. The wind had been scouring the plains for 1,000 years, and it had learned its trade well. It found every crack, every seam, every poorly chinked log, and it never rested. On the edge of a settlement that was little more than a hopeful scar on the vast, grassy landscape, Albrecht Pfennig was doing something strange. He was not building a house. He was cleaning one out. The structure was a relic, an abandoned beehive brick kiln left over from a failed brick-making venture years before. It was a domed cylinder of soot-stained red brick 20 feet across, looking like a monstrous earthen boil on the prairie. While his neighbors were hauling the last of the season's timber and cutting sod, Pfennig was hauling out wagon loads of ash, broken brick, and the skeletal remains of long-dead animals that had sought a final, futile shelter. Cleet Warford, the county building inspector, pulled his buggy to a halt nearby, the dust settling around the wheels. With him was Silas Croft, a rancher whose opinion carried weight. They watched for a long moment as Pfennig, a compact man with arms corded from a lifetime of labor, emerged from the kiln's dark mouth, his face smudged with black. "Pfennig!" Warford called out, his voice sharp with authority. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Albrecht straightened, wiping a hand across his brow, leaving a streak of grime. He looked from Warford to Croft and back again. "I am preparing our home for winter," he said, his German accent still thick. Warford laughed, a short, barking sound that the wind snatched away. "A home? That's a furnace, an oven. It's an industrial structure, not fit for man nor beast." Silas Croft shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. "Albrecht, listen to him. The man's right. We all had a hard first winter, but this is foolish. You can't put Annalise and the children in there. It's a tomb." "It will be warm," Albrecht said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned and disappeared back into the darkness of the kiln. Warford stared at the black opening. "The man is mad," he said to Silas, not bothering to lower his voice. "Utterly mad. He'll freeze his family solid in that brick pile before the new year." The judgment was passed. The community watched and waited for the inevitable tragedy. What did this German brickmaker, this Ziegler, understand about the physics of thermal mass that the most experienced builders on the Nebraska plains, men who had raised cabins against this very wind their entire lives, had missed? This channel is dedicated to the stories of quiet innovators who solved impossible problems with forgotten wisdom. Their neighbors often laughed, but their solutions changed everything. To make sure you don't miss a single story of ingenuity against the odds, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell. I promise you will learn something about the fundamental principles of survival that we've forgotten in our modern age. What's the most unconventional home you've ever seen? Let us know in the comments below. Albrecht Pfennig was not a carpenter, he was not a farmer, and he certainly was not a frontiersman. In his homeland near the Rhine, he had been a master of a single ancient element, fired clay. He was a Ziegler operator, a man whose hands knew the heft of wet earth, the rasp of fire brick, the precise shimmering temperature at which silica vitrifies into something akin to stone. His life had been governed by the slow, deliberate cycles of loading, firing, and cooling massive kilns, just like the one he now claimed as his home. He understood brick not as a building component, but as a vessel for heat. He knew its memory, its stubborn refusal to let go of energy once absorbed. This knowledge had been useless during his family's first winter in Nebraska. They had arrived with the same dreams as everyone else, purchasing a small plot of land and a hastily built timber cabin. The land agent had called it sturdy. It was, in fact, a sieve for warmth. That first winter was a relentless education in the physics of failure. The cabin was a box of cold air surrounded by thin, porous walls. They had burned through their entire woodpile by January, forced to burn green, sappy cottonwood that hissed and smoked, but gave off little heat. Albrecht remembered the nights, huddled with his wife, Anneliese, and their two small children, Hans and Greta, under every blanket they owned. He remembered waking at midnight, the fire dead, the interior of the cabin already approaching the freezing point. The heat they so laboriously created simply vanished, bleeding through the logs into the ravenous cold. The most vivid memory was the frost, not just on the windows, but on the nail heads inside the walls, each one a tiny, glittering star of cold that radiated inward. By dusk, the iron door hinges were coated in a thick layer of white ice, groaning in protest each time the door was opened to the brutal wind. Anneliese had a cough that lingered for months. The children were always cold. They survived, but something in Albrecht had hardened that winter, a resolve as firm as the bricks he once made. He would not let his family suffer like that again. He would not fight the cold with the prairie's flimsy weapons. He would fight it with his own. The problem with the frontier cabins wasn't just poor insulation, a concept they understood in practice, if not in name. The deeper problem, the one no amount of chinking or buffalo robes could solve, was a complete lack of thermal mass. A structure built of wood, a material with a relatively low density and specific heat capacity, is fundamentally a container for warm air, and the log walls themselves stored very little energy. It was like trying to keep water hot in a paper cup. The process was brutally simple and efficient for the cold. A homesteader would light a fire in the cast iron stove. The stove would heat the air in the cabin through convection. For a few hours, the small space would feel warm, even comfortable. But the moment the fire was banked for the night and the stove began to cool, the physics inverted. The thin walls, having stored almost no heat, immediately began to lose what little they had to the outside. The warm air inside, now no longer being replenished, transferred its energy to the cold logs, which then transferred it to the -20 degrees Fahrenheit winds outside. Within 2 or 3 hours, the temperature inside and outside would begin to equalize. By midnight, as Albrecht had learned, and the cabin was little more than a wooden windbreak. This failure was repeated in every homestead across the Sandhills. Families burned through staggering amounts of fuel just to maintain a survivable temperature. Wood, already scarce on the plains, became more valuable than currency. Men would spend their days gathering, chopping, and hauling, only to feed the fruits of their labor into a stove that was constantly losing the battle. The flickering candle on the table wasn't just a source of light. It was a sensitive barometer of the home's integrity. In a standard cabin, its flame danced and bent in the incessant drafts that snaked through the walls. It was a visual representation of the heat being stolen from the air. The conventional wisdom was to build tighter, to chink better, to burn more. Albrecht saw the flaw in the entire premise. The goal shouldn't be to heat the air over and over again. The goal should be to heat the house itself. Albrecht's work on the kiln was one of modification, not construction. The primary structure was already perfect for his needs, a thick-walled, stable dome. His first task was to clean it meticulously, scraping away decades of soot. This wasn't just for cleanliness. He needed a clean surface to inspect the integrity of every brick and mortar joint. He spent a week pointing the mortar, filling every tiny crack with a mixture of local clay, sand, and lime. He was sealing it not just against wind, but against the slow, insidious creep of moisture. Inside, he did not build a large, open fireplace. That would be inefficient, losing most of its heat up a chimney. Instead, within the vast main chamber, he constructed a small, highly efficient firebox in one corner using salvaged fire brick. It was a Russian stove design he remembered from his youth, a masonry heater with a long, convoluted flue path. The smoke and hot gases from a fire would travel through a series of brick channels built into a thick interior wall before they were allowed to exit through a narrow chimney at the top of the dome. This design was meant to strip every possible unit of heat from the exhaust before it escaped. He then partitioned the interior. Using timber framing and plank walls, he created 2 small sleeping chambers and a larger living area. This created a house within a house. The family would live in the insulated wooden core, which was itself inside the massive thermal battery of the kiln walls. Cleet Warford returned in mid-November, as the first snows were beginning to dust the prairie. This time, he was not there for a casual warning. He carried a clipboard and a stern expression. He walked around the kiln, tapping the brickwork with his knuckles. "Pfennig," he began, his tone official, "I've spoken with the county commission. As I told you, this is an industrial structure. It is not zoned for residential use. It doesn't meet any code for a dwelling. There's no proper foundation. The ventilation is inadequate, and frankly, it's a fire hazard." He held up a piece of paper. "This is a formal notice. I am filing to have this structure condemned as unfit for human habitation." Anneliese stood in the arched doorway, her face pale. Hans and Greta clutched at her skirts. Albrecht simply looked at the building inspector, his expression unreadable. He had spent his life around fire contained by brick. He knew the risks better than anyone. "It will be safe," he said. "That's not for you to decide," Warford countered. "The county has regulations for a reason, to protect people from their own foolishness, to protect children." He gestured toward Hans and Greta. "The cold is the hazard," Albrecht replied, his voice still quiet. "This will protect them from the cold. It will be warm." Warford shook his head in exasperation. "I'm posting the notice. You have until the spring thaw to vacate. After that, we'll have it torn down." He tacked the condemnation order to the heavy wooden door Albrecht had installed, the nail driving home with a sound of finality. Albrecht didn't take it down. He left it there, a silent challenge to the winter that was coming. And to understand what Albrecht Pfennig had built, you have to understand the principle of thermal mass. It's a concept fundamentally different from insulation. Insulation is a barrier. Its purpose is to slow the transfer of heat. A down jacket is insulation. Thermal mass, on the other hand, is a reservoir. Its purpose is to store heat. A heavy stone placed near a fire is thermal mass. Every material has a property called specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise its temperature. Water has a very high specific heat capacity, which is why it takes a long time to boil a pot of water, and why that water stays hot for a long time. Wood, the primary material of a frontier cabin, has a much lower specific heat capacity and, more importantly, a low density. A cubic foot of pine weighs about 25 pounds. A cubic foot of dense. Our fired brick, however, weighs about 120 pounds. This is where the numbers become staggering. Due to its density and composition, fired brick can store approximately 4 times the amount of heat energy, or BTUs, per cubic foot as wood. The walls of Albrecht's kiln were 3 feet thick. He had calculated the total mass of the brick in his structure to be over 90 tons. A standard log cabin might contain 10 tons of wood. Albrecht hadn't built a shelter. He had built a 90-ton thermal battery. The process he designed was simple. He would build a single hot fire in his efficient masonry stove. The superheated gases would snake through the interior flue system, transferring the bulk of their energy directly into the brick walls before exiting the chimney. He would fire it for 10 to 12 hours straight, charging the battery. After the fire was out, the physics would reverse. The massive heat-saturated brick walls would begin to radiate that stored energy back into the living space. But the most critical factor was the rate of release. Because of the sheer mass and the insulating properties of the brick itself, the heat would be released incredibly slowly. Albrecht had calculated a temperature drop of less than 2 degrees Fahrenheit per hour. This meant that a single firing could, in theory, keep the interior at a stable, livable temperature for days on end. While his neighbors frantically fed their stoves every few hours just to keep from freezing, Albrecht planned to heat his home once every 3 or 4 days. He was storing warmth, not just making it. He had turned an oven designed to bake clay into a sanctuary designed to nurture life. That winter, the plains received a siege. It began in the second week of December with a blizzard that buried the landscape under 3 feet of snow. And then the temperature dropped. It fell past 0, past 10 below, past 15. For 25 consecutive days, the thermometer in the settlement never rose above negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind was a constant, physical presence, sculpting the snow into knife-edge drifts and driving the cold into the very bones of the earth. For the settlers in their timber and sod cabins, it was a waking nightmare. Woodpiles vanished at an alarming rate. The green wood they were forced to burn offered little comfort. Livestock froze standing in their pens. The simple act of opening a door was a tactical decision, weighed against the precious warmth that would be lost. Men wrapped their faces in scarves to make the 50-yard dash to the woodpile, the air so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. Inside, families lived in a state of perpetual twilight, huddled around their stoves, wearing their coats day and night. The world shrank to a small circle of meager warmth in a vast, encroaching sea of cold. At the Pfennig residence, life was different. On the first day of the cold snap, Albrecht loaded his firebox with cottonwood. For 12 hours, a thin ribbon of smoke curled from the kiln's chimney. He and Hans fed the fire steadily, keeping it hot and clean. The inner walls of the kiln grew warm to the touch, then hot. By evening, The entire structure was saturated with thermal energy. Then he let the fire die. The coals burned down to a bed of gray ash. And that was it. For the next 3 days, there was no smoke from the kiln's chimney. Inside, a profound and gentle warmth radiated from the walls. The air temperature held steady at a comfortable 58 degrees. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an iron stove, but a quiet, pervasive warmth that filled every corner of the space. While their neighbors' water buckets were solid blocks of ice, Annalise did laundry, hanging the wet clothes on a line strung across the living area where they dried in a few hours. The domestic warmth technique was most evident in the simple act of baking. Annalise would knead her bread dough and place the large wooden bowl directly against the interior brick wall. There, in the steady, gentle radiance, the yeast would activate, and the dough would rise, slow and perfect. The smell of baking bread filled their strange, round home, a scent of impossible normalcy in the midst of a brutal winter. Hans and Greta played on the floor with their wooden toys, not in heavy coats, but in their simple woolen sweaters, their fingers nimble and warm. The condemnation notice on the door was a distant memory. The walls, it seemed, had already passed a higher judgment. On the 4th day, as his neighbors watched with a mixture of suspicion and morbid curiosity, Albrecht fired the kiln again for half a day. The cycle repeated. While the rest of the settlement was consumed by the minute-to-minute battle for survival, the Pfennigs lived by a different rhythm, one of slow, deep cycles of energy, a life measured in days, not hours. By the 3rd week of the siege, a grim silence had fallen over the settlement. People were exhausted, and their fuel supplies dwindling dangerously. It was during this period that word began to circulate about Albrecht Pfennig. No one had seen smoke from his chimney in almost 3 days. In a world where a dead chimney meant a dead family, the conclusion was obvious and tragic. The foolish German had finally paid the price for his madness. Cleet Warford heard the news with a heavy heart. He felt a pang of guilt. He had tried to warn him. He had posted the notice. But now, the thought of that woman and her 2 small children, frozen in that brick tomb, was more than he could bear. Bundled in his heaviest coat, he saddled his horse and rode out to the kiln, the official condemnation notice still folded in his inside pocket. He intended to serve it on a dead man, a final, futile act of bureaucracy. The cold was astonishing. His horse's breath plumed and froze instantly into a cloud of ice crystals. The snow squeaked under the hooves with a dry, alien sound. As he approached the kiln, he saw no tracks, no sign of life. He dismounted, his legs stiff, and walked to the heavy door. He steeled himself for what he would find inside. He expected to be hit by a wall of absolute, deathly cold, the frigid air of a place where life had ceased. He knocked. There was no answer. Taking a deep breath, he lifted the latch and pushed the door open. The first sensation was one of pure confusion. There was no blast of Arctic air. The air that greeted him from inside was not hot, but it was profoundly, shockingly not cold. It was still and temperate. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and he saw Albrecht Pfennig sitting at a small wooden table, calmly mending a piece of leather harness. Annalise was sewing nearby, and the 2 children were asleep in a small bedroom, visible through an open doorway. Warford stood there, speechless, the frigid air from outside swirling around his boots. "My God, Pfennig," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. "We thought, everyone thought you were dead." Albrecht looked up from his work. "We are well, Mr. Warford. Please, come in. Shut the door." Warford stepped inside and closed the door, the silence of the space settling around him. He could feel the gentle warmth on his face, a sensation so alien after the biting wind that it felt like a dream. He looked around. There was no fire in the masonry stove. The firebox was dark. The floor around it swept clean. "When did you last have a fire?" Warford asked, his voice barely a whisper. Albrecht considered for a moment. "It was Tuesday morning," he said. It was now late afternoon on Friday. 3 days. Warford's mind struggled to comprehend it. 3 days in this cold, with no fire. It was impossible. It defied every law of survival he knew. He walked past Pfennig, his boots sounding loud on the wooden floor. He approached the curved, soot-stained brick wall of the kiln itself. He pulled off his thick leather glove, his fingers numb from the ride. He expected the brick to feel like a block of ice, to suck the very heat from his skin. He hesitated, then placed his bare palm flat against the wall. The proof was immediate, undeniable, and profound. A deep, steady, gentle warmth flowed from the brick into his hand. It was not the searing heat of a stovepipe, but the ancient, stored warmth of a sun-warmed stone. It was a living heat, a warmth that felt as if it came from the center of the earth. He pressed his hand harder against it, feeling the solid truth of it. The brick held the memory of Tuesday's fire and was still sharing it on Friday. He stood there for a full minute, his palm flat against the wall, the gentle warmth seeping into his hand, up his arm, melting a core of disbelief that had been frozen solid within him. He finally dropped his arm. He looked at Albrecht, who had watched him without a word. The German brickmaker simply nodded, a small, knowing gesture. Warford reached into his coat and slowly pulled out the folded, creased condemnation notice. He looked at the official text, the confident, ignorant words declaring this place unfit. He looked at the sleeping children, safe and warm. He looked at the life-giving wall. Then, without a word, he folded the paper again, tucked it deep into his pocket, and turned to leave. At the door, he stopped. "Pfennig," he said, his voice thick with a new kind of respect. "You didn't build a house." He paused, searching for the right words. "You built a slow-burning ember." Cleet Warford did not tear up the condemnation notice. He filed it away. In its place, he wrote a new report, one that would have a far greater impact. He was a man of regulations and codes, but above all, he was a pragmatist. He had witnessed something that overturned the established rules of construction on the frontier. He spent 2 more days with Pfennig, taking meticulous notes, measuring wall thickness, sketching the design of the masonry heater, and recording fuel consumption. His report to the Nebraska County Commission was not the story of a madman, but the technical analysis of a genius. He argued that in a land as brutally cold and fuel-scarce as the Sandhills, Pfennig's principles of high thermal mass were not an oddity. They were a necessity. He proposed that all new public buildings, offices, schools, sheriff's stations, be built not with wood, but with brick, using Pfennig's heat storage principles. The idea was met with skepticism, but Warford's reputation was unassailable, and the memory of the great winter siege was still fresh and painful. The numbers he presented were undeniable. Pfennig had used less than a quarter of the wood his neighbors had burned, while maintaining a more stable and healthy indoor temperature. The proposal was approved. Over the next decade, the Pfennig method became a quiet standard for civic architecture in the region. The county land office in Kearney was built with double-thick brick walls and a central masonry heater. In North Platte, the new schoolhouse incorporated a massive south-facing brick wall to absorb the winter sun. In total, official county records show that 4 Nebraska government offices were directly modeled on the principles Warford had documented from the converted kiln. The innovation spread, not as a folksy curiosity, but as adopted policy. The German brickmaker's wisdom was now embedded in the very foundations of the communities that had once called him a fool. The principles that Albrecht Pfennig deployed out of desperation in 1882 were a century ahead of their time. What he understood intuitively, modern building science would later formalize with terms like thermal flywheel effect and passive survivability. His kiln home was, in essence, a massive, uninsulated trombe wall, absorbing and radiating energy on a multi-day cycle. Today, architects and engineers designing high-performance, low-energy buildings use these same core ideas. They specify materials with high thermal mass, like concrete, stone, or phase-change materials, to stabilize indoor temperatures and reduce the load on mechanical heating and cooling systems. Passive solar design, a cornerstone of sustainable architecture, is entirely dependent on the strategic use of thermal mass to store the sun's energy during the day and release it slowly during the night. Albrecht's masonry heater is the direct ancestor of modern, high-efficiency wood stoves that use baffles and catalytic converters to extract the maximum amount of heat from their fuel. He had no computers, no advanced material science, but he had a deep, tactile understanding of how energy and mass interacted. The quiet German brickmaker had stumbled upon the foundational truths of a science that wouldn't have a name for another 100 years. There is a deep wisdom in old things, in materials that have been tested by forces greater than ourselves. The bricks of that Nebraska kiln had survived 1,000 firings. Their entire existence had been a cycle of absorbing overwhelming heat and then holding it, letting it go slowly, without shattering. They had been made for that purpose. They knew how to endure. Albrecht Pfennig saw that. He didn't see an abandoned oven. He saw a vessel that knew how to hold what mattered. He wasn't just fighting the cold. He was entrusting his family's survival to the very nature of the material he had mastered. The walls did not just block the wind. They absorbed the fierce temporary energy of a fire and transformed it into a gentle, lasting warmth. They held the life of the family within them, a quiet, steady presence against a brutal and indifferent world. In the end, the walls that had been designed to create objects of hardness and utility were repurposed to protect the softest and most precious things of all. They knew how to hold on. Thank you for joining us for this story of frontier ingenuity. If you found the science and the history as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten genius. We're committed to bringing these stories to light. What other historical innovations have you heard of that seemed strange at first, but proved to be brilliant? Share your thoughts in the comments section below. Disclaimer: this video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative purposes. However, the building techniques and scientific principles discussed are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and engineering standards. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.